there are many obvious differences between, both in substance and in form, between an ILO report and what this report is. Second, and this is a related point, at the very beginning of their deliberations, of their work, the commissioners decided that what they wanted was a short, political, action-oriented, and a bit provocative report that would speak to policymakers as well as the general public. And that really was quite a challenge as the report was being put together. Because if you can imagine 27 commissioners with very different, often complementary, but not always complementary ideas, having to take all of that material and distill it down into a 10,000 or 11,000 word report. This was quite a challenge. But this was what they wanted, and I think they all are pleased that this is what they saw in the final product, drafts of which they reviewed over and over. As a result of what they wanted, we don't have a technical report and we don't have an analytical report. We have a report with concrete recommendations within an overall framework of social justice, of the challenges that are confronting us. And the big questions about, so how do we implement this, are out there not just for the ILO to respond to, but for policymakers around the globe to respond to. So in many ways, as the commissioners say in the last line of their report, this is the beginning of the journey. I also want to emphasize one other thing that was crucial in all of the deliberations of the commission that came out really at the very beginning of their meetings. There was, on the part of many commissioners, an insistence that we had to address certain issues. One was this report had to speak to developing economies as well as advanced economies, and that the changes we're seeing in the future of work look very different depending on the level of economic development. And they insisted on this throughout the report and throughout all the drafts that they went through. And that meant that they were focused on issues like informality and the rural economy throughout their work. Second, there was an insistence on the part of many commissioners that this report had to address gender inequalities. And again, that is reflected in the report. This came from commissioners whose own backgrounds and whose own expertise lay in different levels of development as well. So one other thing this report isn't, and I've alluded to this, it's not a blueprint for the ILO's work. And Greg will elaborate on this more. It is a set of signposts, if you will, and I'm not even sure I'd call it a roadmap, but goals to achieve as we address the most challenging issues as we move into the future of work. So as an overall frame, the Commission's report calls for a human-centered agenda for the future of work that puts people and the work they do at the center of economic and social policy, as well as at the center of business practice. And as the deliberations progressed, three central pillars of the human-centered agenda emerged: investing in people's capabilities, increasing investments in the institutions of work, and increasing investment in decent and sustainable work. So let me turn to the first pillar, investing in people's capabilities. And I should say that for the Commission, this isn't an a la carte menu. This is an integrated whole, although, of course, that begs the question of where do you start? Within this first pillar, the increasing investment in people's capabilities. I think the guiding principle behind this is that the Commission believes that we need a human-centered agenda so that people can develop their capabilities, taking advantage of the opportunities that lie ahead. This is not about molding people to the enterprise opportunities that may exist, to the skills opportunities that may present themselves, and it's not about human capital. It's something much more broad. If you're familiar with the works of Amartya Sen or Martha Nussbaum, much of their work about human capabilities and agency informs this pillar. Now, the first recommendation here is lifelong learning for all. We already know that education is a human right, and the Commission really wants to see the entitlement to lifelong learning as an extension of lifelong learning. We all know that people will have to skill, upskill, reskill throughout their lives. We know that that whole process really will begin in early childhood and will need to continue as people work longer if they so choose to. The next, and I will say that there are some recommendations in this about how to finance lifelong learning and the need to share the financial responsibilities for it. The next recommendation is supporting people through transitions. As the world of work progresses, as changes come about more rapidly, more and more transitions will confront people in their working lives. And we need public policies that support people through these transitions. Of course, that includes social protection, but it also includes other institutions as well. One of the things that the Commission recognized is that the three-stage life that I think we in this room expect for ourselves, that certainly our parents and even our grandparents assumed in some ways, that is some version of education and then using one's skills in a relatively single kind of working life, that is one set of skills, equipping oneself throughout life, and then retirement is no longer a viable model. And that's particularly true as the demographics tell us we have an increasingly aging society. So the transitions will both become more complex and will also multiply. The third recommendation in this pillar is a transformative agenda for gender equality. And as the Commission report says, gender equality begins in the home. So for the Commission, looking at care work and unpaid care work as a fundamental, as a root cause of gender inequality was very important. And so while there are a lot of other recommendations about achieving gender equality, I think for the Commission, putting in place policies that rebalance gender equality at home, including how we value and how we do and who does unpaid care work, are really the sort of the fundamental principles of moving forward towards gender equality. The fourth recommendation here is one that's familiar to all of you and that I've already mentioned, and that's not just strengthening social protection, but universal social protection from birth to old age through shared responsibilities, through solidarity and risk sharing. The second pillar is increasing investment in the institutions of work. And those institutions, as you all know, include labor inspection systems, labor administration, representative organizations of workers and employers, regulatory and legal obligations. And these are the building blocks, according to the Commission, of just societies. We know that as digital technologies change and the way in which work is organized and monitored using algorithms, using sensors and wearables, the Commission was concerned that not only is labor still not a commodity and should never be a commodity, but it's also not a robot. And so for the Commission, it's important to strengthen the institutions that assure the dignity of work. And that's also key to addressing widespread economic insecurity, reducing inequality, and forging pathways to formalization. The next recommendation is one that has actually gained a lot of interest. And I would say it's both, there are both supporters and there are both skeptics here. But the Commission is urging establishing a universal labor guarantee that includes but goes further than the fundamental rights at work. So it would include, and first, the most important point here is that the universal labor guarantee needs to extend to all workers regardless of their employment status, regardless of what kind of work they do and how they do their work. Now, it includes, in addition to the fundamental rights at work, it includes an adequate living wage, which in the report is always in quotation marks because this comes directly from the ILO Constitution, maximum limits on hours of work, and protection of safety and health at work. Now, in fact, these all come from the ILO Constitution, and you can find them in those incredibly inspiring words in the preamble, but they remain to some extent some of the unfinished business of the ILO's mandate. And so for the Commission, this is a time, given widespread informality, increasing inequalities, demographic shifts, climate change, technological changes, it's time to reinvigorate the commitment to achieving the universal labor guarantee. The second recommendation, and I think this is really related to the universal labor guarantee, is achieving time sovereignty. This is really about taking advantage of the technological changes that are presenting themselves and will continue to present themselves so that workers can gain more control over their time, achieve greater control over their ability to fulfill work and non-work responsibilities. So again, integrally linked not only to the universal labor guarantee, but to gender equality. Third, revitalizing collective representation. So I think for the Commission, none of this is achievable without strong representative workers and employers organizations. And governments as well need to guarantee freedom of association and collective bargaining, and they need to adopt policies that recognize that social dialogue and collective bargaining are public goods. They need to be protected and promoted through policies that treat them as public goods. The fourth recommendation here is technology for decent work. Now, one of the things I should have said when I started is that this is not fundamentally a report about technology. It's not about how many jobs will be created and how many jobs will be destroyed or in what industries and sectors that may happen. Those are very important debates, but the Commission felt that its contribution would really lie elsewhere. When it came to technology, the Commission is emphasizing a kind of human-centered technology, a human-in-command approach to technology that uses technology to enhance what workers do, to, again, give them more time sovereignty, and to really harness the ways in which technology enables work. And so later on in the report, the ILO, the Commission calls for the ILO to set up an innovation lab on technology to make this happen. Now, this is the section of the report that has also gained some buzz, if you will, because there's a call for an international governance framework for the digital economy, for platform work. And there's a reference to the Maritime Labor Convention as a potential model for how we might achieve an international governance framework. And why is that? Because when maritime workers are on the high seas, they are not in any particular jurisdiction. And yet, there's a framework that governs their working conditions. In the same way, those who work on the digital platform really don't work anywhere, right? You may be physically in X location, but you're working across many different time zones and maybe across continents. So it's an imperfect analogy. The maritime sector is heavily organized. The platform economy is not organized at all at this point, or barely, but it's the kernel of a thought of how this could get done. Turning to the third pillar, increasing investment in decent and sustainable work. The Commission looked at any number of sectors or areas in the economy where greater investment could lead to better work, more decent work, in the context of rapid technological changes. The Commission also spent a long time debating about the incentives that businesses need and will need in order to make long-term investments in people, as opposed to short-term investments in shareholders. And so you can imagine that this was quite a lively debate. In terms of prioritizing areas of the economy, the Commission focused on several. One is the green economy, and of course this is where the just transition comes in. One is the care economy, for reasons I've already mentioned, and the other is the rural economy. Because yes, urban areas and industrialization will progress, but the rural economy is where so many of the world's workers work and live in conditions of informality, and they'll always have to, because we will always need food. In addition, the Commission recommended increasing investments in both digital, physical, and social infrastructure. Investments in digital infrastructure are key in the developing world if we're going to bridge the digital divide between developing and advanced economies, between the informal and the formal economies. And so investing in infrastructure, which, and you can see articles, both scholarly and in the newspaper, all the time about increasing investments in infrastructure, was really key for the Commission. In terms of shifting incentives for business practices to encourage long-term investments in the real economy, the Commission looked at various ways in which this could be accomplished, and felt that it needed to be accomplished in order to shift the emphasis right now on the short term into a more stakeholder-oriented, long-term kind of investment system. And so the Commission has called for examining accounting standards and reporting frameworks for businesses around the world, because these are governed by international standards, and they all promote the kind of short-termism that is simply leading to increased financialization of the economy. So the last part of the report talks about taking responsibility. as an overall frame, the Commission looked at the 1919 ILO Constitution and the kinds of legal frameworks that developed after that, and said, these are very ambitious social contracts where they exist, but they need to be reinvigorated, and they don't exist all around the world. There are countries which are really at the beginning of their journey of developing a social contract. So the Commission is calling for national future of work agendas in all countries at no matter what level of economic and social development. Second, the Commission is really calling for the ILO to take its place, its rightful place in the international system. And if you read the Constitution, you can see how ambitious the founders of the ILO were in terms of where the ILO needs to place itself, which is really at the center of economic and social debate. So the Commission is really calling on the ILO to push forward with that agenda. And finally, the Commission is calling for the multilateral system as a whole to take up the human-centered agenda and to make it real, to address the inequalities that are growing around the world and all of the rapid changes that can go either way depending on the policies that we put in place. So let me just wrap up quickly to say this is the what and a little bit of the why. The big question that I get as I talk about the report is, so how do we do it? And this has tremendous implications for our own work. How will we take on board the Commission's recommendations? And where will that lead us as we move into the next biennium, and even before that, as we move into the conference? So I think this is a good transition moment because Greg is really spearheading the work around the Centenary, the outcome document for that we all anticipate will result from the conference and which will take on board the Commission's report. So
certainly it is our intention and our hope to get as much information out to you all around all of the work that will be going on arising from the Global Commission report in the lead up to the conference, and then of course after the conference as well. As Deborah indicated right at the start, this report, the Future of Work report, is not an ILO report, it's a Global Commission report. And so now what the ILO needs to do, and by the ILO I mean not only the office but the organisation as represented through the conference, also has to decide what it's going to do with this report and how we embrace the report. And indeed there's a number of steps that will be occurring over the next few months for the first half of this year that will help us come to those decisions. The first of those is a decision that the governing body took in November last year with regards to the preparations for the program and budget for the next biennium. Normally, we would be dealing with the program and budget, the full program and budget, at this forthcoming March governing body to be endorsed by the conference in June of this year. What the governing body agreed to this time around, though, was that for its consideration in March, in effect, all we will be presenting will be the global budget, the overall ILO budget. We will not be going into detail on the programming aspect of it, the outcomes or the strategic plan or any of that. Instead, the governing body agreed that we wait until the outcome of the conference and then come back to the governing body in November, at which stage we formulate the program of work for the ILO for the next 2 years. And in the program and budget paper that has just been released for March, if you have a chance to read it, you'll see that the DG refers to the next biennium as being a period of reorientation for the ILO. Don't worry, it's not another period of reform or transition or anything else. It's a period of reorientation, and that is how do we go from where we are now to embracing the outcome of this report, or at least what our constituents want us to do with the outcome of this report. So the next 6 months is going to be a great deal of detailed work. So that's how we're dealing with it, if you like, in that process sense. The second, and I think extremely important aspect of this, is that we have asked all member states to engage in tripartite local dialogues between now and the conference. You'll recall this was a major feature that we had in the lead up to the Global Commission, where we asked member states to have their own tripartite dialogues around the future of work and the issues that were relevant to each of those member states. And I think we had some 120 countries conduct those sorts of discussions at that time. We're encouraging them to repeat that, but this time looking at the Future of Work report and seeing how it specifically relates to their environment, to the individual national environments, and what they need to bring to the ILO in terms of their response to it. And then the follow-up to that stage will of course be the conference itself. And the conference, as our Centenary conference, is largely focused around issues clearly of the Centenary, but largely around the future of work. The whole of the plenary session of the governing body of the conference, and it will sit for the whole of the 2 weeks, will be focused on the Global Commission report. So all of the interventions in the plenary, we hope, will be focused on national responses to it. In addition to that, we're going to have, over a period of probably 5 days, a series of special panels, special debates, special events that will be looking at all of the issues associated with our broader Centenary initiatives, but in particular the interplay between those and the future of work. And then the third aspect, and possibly one of the most important aspects both for the office and the organisation, is what we call a committee of the whole, which will be dealing with the so-called ILC 2019 outcome document. So what I wanted to briefly do today was just update you as to where we are in our preparations and in our discussions on this. Last year in November, the GB decided a 4-step process for developing this outcome document. The first of those was for a working paper for informal consultations in February. We prepared that working paper over late last year and early this year, and we've had that first round of consultations with the 3 groups, with the workers, the employers and the governments throughout last week. So we've released the paper, we've had some feedback from them. The second stage, which we've just started this week, is to turn that working paper into a governing body paper, taking into account the feedback that we got in the consultations last week, and for that to be the building blocks for the outcome document. I wouldn't call it a first draft, but starting to head in the direction of what we expect the outcome document will look like, and that will be there for debate and guidance by the governing body in March. Then following that governing body decision, we prepare a third paper, and this time, of course, taking into account the discussions of the governing body, and then as a result of those, that paper and consultations in April, we then prepare the actual draft text for the outcome document. One of the things that did arise, or one of the outcomes from the consultations last week, was what appears to be a bit of an appetite for accelerating this process. And in all likelihood, and we will include this in the paper to the governing body, in all likelihood, we would aim to have the first draft of the document in that third point there, so that we'll have a first draft of the outcome document, we hope, for those consultations in April, which allows more time then for trying to reach tripartite consensus on it. Because of what we see the significance of this document has been, and I'll come to that in a minute, we do think, well, we know that the maximum level of convergence, the maximum level of consensus before the conference is going to be essential. If we haven't got agreement, or a large degree of agreement and convergence before the conference, we're certainly not going to reach it during the conference. So we need to be putting a great deal of effort into this over the next couple of months. In terms of the considerations of what this document might look like, and I can probably stop referring to it now as an outcome document, because one of the positive reactions we got last week were a number of the constituents, a significant number of constituents, agreeing the concept of this being a declaration, which had always been our intention but had not been endorsed. But we believe, and we'll be putting this to the governing body in March as well, that we should be pursuing this as a declaration, which of course is a very significant document for the ILO to produce through the conference. What the main considerations behind the declaration will be that it must be based on our Constitution, in particular the preamble to the Constitution and the previous declarations. The most significant of those previous declarations is, of course, the Philadelphia Declaration, but then also we've got the 1998 and the 2008 declarations as well to build on. But it's important that it's not just a mere reaffirmation of these. What we want to be trying to do is look at these instruments, these previous instruments, and how can we build on them to make these documents to have a contemporary consolidation, if you like, that's appropriate for the ILO to be starting the second century with. It is quite amazing, though, for those of you who have seen the other short video that we've prepared and that was launched on the 22nd of January, the one where the dialogue is of reading of the preamble of the Constitution. It's extraordinary to see how relevant those words still are now, where we were able to contrast the photographs and the footage from 100 years ago against what it is in the contemporary work, and the words ring as true today as they did then. And so what we want to make sure is that we reflect that we reaffirm that, and preferably even strengthen what's in there. It's got to be concise, it's got to be action orientated, and it's really got to set the long-term direction for the ILO and not be time-bound. So we're not talking about words that are going to date this. We won't make reference to, for example, the 2030 agenda, because that'll be gone in 12 years' time. We really want this to be a long-lasting, long-living document. It's of course got to identify the challenges that we're facing, and we've already heard about a lot of those, and it's got to take into account the outcome of the Global Commission, as well as setting that future direction for the ILO. And importantly, and this was endorsed very strongly last week as well, it's got to be relevant to all member states at all stages of development. And I think an interesting nuance with this as well is if we think back to what the ILO was in 1919, and indeed what it was in 1944 at the time of the Philadelphia Declaration, our membership, our constituent, is extraordinarily different now to what it was then. So we've got to make sure that what we're preparing now reflects that much greater diversity in the member state membership of the ILO. Some of the reasons, and I'll try and go through this fairly quickly because I prefer to get involved in a discussion with you. Why are we talking about a declaration? We want to be reflecting the ILO's leading role in shaping the future of work. And that's deliberately worded as shaping the future of work. We don't want to be reacting to it. We don't want to be responding to it. We want to be shaping it. It's got to consider those major developments and challenges, and there's many of them, but the main ones and the most obvious ones are around demographic change, environmental sustainability, digital society, changing patterns of employment relationships and production, and of course inequalities and persistent gender gaps. And also taking into account the very significant developments in the multilateral system, but also the ILO place in that multilateral system. So looking at the decent work, our normative functions, our tripartite structures, and the overall need to end poverty, and looking at ILO's role in all of those together with its role in the multilateral system. And also the added value of having a guide to the ILO, or more than a guide, but a clear, strong statement as to what our long-term objectives and priorities need to be. In terms of the scope and elements of the document, there's really 5 of these. The first one is, as I indicated before, the reference back to our previous instruments, but also recognising that in the changing context, and the fact that there is some unfinished business. If we had achieved universal peace, and if we had achieved universal social justice, we'd all be out of a job. We haven't done that yet, so we know there's some unfinished business. So we've got to look at what that unfinished business is and put that into the contemporary world. We've also, of course, got to address the challenges and opportunities arising from the transformational change in the world of work. We've got to pick up the core theme that runs through the Global Commission report as well, around the human-centred agenda. And how do we use that human-centred agenda lens to look at basically what we're doing now, the work that we already know about, the priorities, the issues around decent work, inclusive growth, the fact that labour is not a commodity, our full and sustainable employment and decent work, making technology serve the people. These are all issues that we all deal with on a day-to-day basis, but we've got to change our focus a bit and look at it from that human-centred agenda approach. And how do we express this in a declaration? Similarly, with the objectives and focused area for action, again, there is and I won't go through them all, but there is a large range of these that we all know about, that we're all working on, and in many cases we know we've got to be working on but haven't had the resources or the priorities to do so. And so we've got to, again, try and come up with a concise way of framing some of these issues as those priorities, and particularly looking at some of these emerging issues that we weren't even talking about 10 years ago, around the green economy, around environmental sustainability, the care economy, the platform and digital economy and so on, investing in people, enhancing governance of work, importantly the strong role but also the stronger role our whole standard system needs to be playing, the role of social dialogue, the role of tripartism. A lot of discussion last week as well around the changing nature of employment relationships and the ILO's role in that, and our social partners' role in that as well. And also the part that came out of the Global Commission report on transforming economies to promote decent and sustainable work. A fifth part, and again a critical part of the declaration, is this building partnerships for social justice. Not just building partnerships because it's a cool thing to do, but we really want to be building partnerships around what the ILO's priorities are, and that is social justice in the future of work. It's got to reflect the leadership role of the ILO, the impact of globalisation and international cooperation. By globalisation here, we're not just talking about economic globalisation, but the whole approach that's increasingly being required of international and multilateral organisations. But it's really also around this strong cooperation and cohesiveness between those organisations. And we've also got to be looking at the issues around new partnerships, looking beyond our traditional partnerships to ensure that the ILO is there central, that we're bringing the rest of the international multilateral community, or at least those parts that are relevant, along behind the decent work agenda and the pursuit of social justice. And then the final part of the discussions have been, and the paper and the discussions last week have been, around the implementation and the possible follow-up. The view from the office, from the Director General, from the senior management team, has been that we don't want a similar follow-up type of mechanism to what we have with the Social Justice Declaration or the 1998 Declaration. Instead, what we see is that this document should be at such a level, it should be such an influential and important document, that the follow-up is the program and budget. That this declaration, if it goes in the direction that we hope it will go in, will frame what it is we are all here to do in all of the different roles that we play within the office. And so even though we have, from the discussions last week, a number of constituents are saying they want a second part to the document, they do want a roadmap, they want it time-bound, they want targets and all of the other things that we see in these follow-up mechanisms, there are others who are tending more to our view that this should be so powerful and so significant in its own right that it frames everything that we do. And so this will be part of the discussion that we have in the governing body as well, but we do believe that the most appropriate way, the most effective way to ensure that we actually deliver on this is that we put all of our resources behind it, that we put our whole program and budget behind it. Now, that means it's got to be broad in scope, because it doesn't just mean that we define 6 things in here and that's all we do. We've got to find a way of incorporating all of the work that we need to do into the future as part of this general direction as well. So I'll stop there, but we're both happy to answer any questions, but it's going to be an extremely demanding period over the next few months. We are certainly eager to get any responses, any input, any thoughts and suggestions from colleagues, and obviously as this progresses over the next few months we'll be counting on more and more input from you all. So thank you. And back to you, Alex. Oh, well, I'll start and Deborah can correct me. The impact on previous declarations, we hope the impact will be that makes those, it strengthens those previous declarations, reaffirms them, but then incorporates them into our moving forward as well. In this, we're not discarding any of those previous significant instruments. Instead, how do we reaffirm them? How do we put them into the relevant context that we're stepping forward to over the coming years? In terms of the implementation, and from what I understand the question has been, was really about the impact on the office and the way we do our work and the sort of work we do. As I indicated before, the DG is describing the next 2 years as a reorientation period. So this is a period where once we've got the outcome from the conference, it gives us a chance as the office to look at how we address the priorities the conference has determined, how we deliver those services to constituents, how we phase out work that we might not need to do in the future into work that we do need to do in the future. And this is going to need to be a very collaborative effort right across the office. If you look at it also in the context of our colleagues in the field, they're going through not only these sorts of changes, but also the structural changes arising from UN reform. So how do we bring all of this in as well? I think we need to be using that example of UN reform very much to our advantage. In this hopefully the declaration and the Global Commission report gives our work a very strong contemporary focus. It gives us a powerful tool to be using in our work with all the other UN agencies as well. And so we've got to exploit that in a positive sense to the fullest extent possible. As far as the other Centenary initiatives go, they were Centenary initiatives. It's now the Centenary, so they move into a different phase. I think that certainly the issues around gender, the initiatives around gender, around climate, around governance, easily become incorporated into our ongoing work. And they're the sorts of issues as well that in one way or another will be reflected in the outcome. So I think with the, generally speaking, and Deborah might have some more detailed views on this, but I think those Centenary initiatives would cease to be separately identified initiatives and become fully integrated in the work that we're otherwise doing.
Add a couple of thoughts on the question about the impact on our work. I see this by starting with the launch of the report, but this year, so the report, the conference, the declaration, and moving to a P&B for the next biennium as an enormous opportunity to take a very close, sharp look at what our priorities have been, and to say to ourselves, okay, here are the major challenges that we face for social justice as we move forward. How do we become more targeted and have greater impact in the world of work? And how would we structure what we now call our outcomes? I think it's an enormous opportunity to think creatively, and I think we've been given not just the opportunity, but almost the mandate to do that. And I think if we don't, we will have lost a moment that we won't get back. On the Centenary initiatives, you can see them threaded through the Commission's report. You can see them threaded through the major themes in the future of work. You can also see them threaded through the work that we do now in our current outcomes. So they all fuel the effort that we'll be going through this year. So I'll start on that question. We're really encouraging all of our member states to have some kind of national dialogue on the Future of Work report, just as we encourage them quite successfully to have national dialogues on the future of work as we began this process. And while the recommendations in the report are an integrated whole, every country starts at a different point and at a different, and with different urgent needs. And so I think the role of decent work country teams is to try to support that thinking at country level and to help governments and the social partners focus on what their priorities are going to be for the future of work, and then incorporate that into the work of the Decent Work Country team, the Decent Work Country program. And that is also an opportunity, I think, to strengthen what we're doing as part of UN country teams and in our engagement with UN reform as well.
The only thing I would add is to reinforce that last point, as I indicated before. I think, we anticipate that the declaration will give us a very focused approach to take into our discussions generally in the multilateral system, but certainly in terms of the UN country teams, that we'll have a clear direction, we'll have some clear priorities, and hopefully by that time as well, there's been the national tripartite discussions that are looking at the Future of Work report in their own context. So it gives us that opportunity the second half of this year throughout next year to really try and bring those together and to, as far as possible, to shape the UNDAFs around that as well, not just the Decent Work programs, Decent Work Country programs. I've got a short answer, but I don't want to scare people. But the short answer is yes, potentially. And indeed, the DG in the program and budget paper, which I encourage you all to have a look at, has indicated that as a possibility arising from all of this. He's not foreshadowing it in any firm sense, but clearly, when we're operating on a zero growth budget, when we have such powerful tools as the Global Commission report, which really start to focus the mind on what it is the ILO is here to do, what it is we need to do to achieve our original mandate, clearly there's new stuff that we've got to do. If we've got no extra money, there's old stuff we've got to stop doing. So it's not only, I think it's probably not only the actual physical parts of the work that we do, but also the way we go about doing that work. And I see that there is the potential for us to look not just at the field structure per se, but at the relationship between the head office structure and the field structure. And, you know, as Deborah said before, we only get a chance to do this once in 100 years. So, you know, I think it would be a missed opportunity for the ILO, for us in the office, not to take a really hard look at both, not only what it is we're doing, but how we do that as well, how we're serving our constituents, how we're getting the best out of the expertise that resides within the office to, as I say, to make that difference to ordinary people in the world, and that's why we're all here. So, you know, we are hopeful that there will be some courageous, some ambitious thinking, some risk-taking as part of all of this as we develop over the period of reorientation to really set ourselves up. I hope you don't disagree with me. I would probably use the word hoping rather than expecting, because you are absolutely right. It is going to be extraordinarily challenging. The consultations we had last week were probably more positive and more constructive than what we were anticipating. And I think from those consultations last week, we've got quite a bit of licence as to what we put to the governing body and for making that, you know, fairly ambitious and fairly strong. As well as this track of consultations that I had up on the screen earlier, of course this is an issue that we'll be having bilateral consultations, you know, at the highest levels of government as well, and they have commenced, and we've already received strong indications of support for the general direction from senior levels in government, not just the diplomats who we deal here with on a day-by-day basis. So I think there is certainly amongst our three groups quite a convergence of support for a strong and ambitious document, but also one that's capable of consensus. Now, the big risk for the ILO in getting something that's capable of consensus, you often end up with the lowest common denominator, and that's what we've got to avoid. And I think that there would be a view, I think as well, a shared view, that if we can't get something that's aiming high, we're better off with nothing. You know, we don't want a second-rate document. And so I think the intention at this stage is to really exploit the short period of time we've got available to work as closely as we can with constituents to really try and ramp this up into something that resonates with all three groups of constituents, is meaningful and is capable of having an impact. So whether I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll get there and strongly hoping that we do.
Yeah, I share Greg's cautious optimism. I do think it's more than possible to get there. Having been in the consultations last week, I think there's, as Greg has said, there's a lot of will to make this happen. I think the less we get bogged down in the how to do all of this and what should the office focus on, my own personal view is the more likely we are to be successful. That in itself is an enormous challenge, but I think we can get there, particularly if we move into the conference with a document that is relatively well received and where there are common assumptions about what we're trying to do and what the length of the document should be and the level of where the detail should stop. But the next phase, which is equally challenging, is again it's the how-to. So how do we as an organization translate this into action? And I think it's those. So that's sort of the second phase of this enormous challenge. And I think that will then determine whether we need to do our work in a different way.
I'll pick up on I forgot to mention just the very last comment you made about no, what's the term we use, no follow-up mechanism or implementation mechanism. Certainly that's not what I meant to express before. What we're saying is there would be no separate one. There would be no discrete one. Instead, what we hope, it will be the program and budget. It will be expressed in our outcomes or however we describe the program. It, in theory, should replace the strategic framework, the 4-yearly strategic framework we have, because it should be, you know, the highest priorities for the office. And then we need to look at our biennial implementation report, which is the report to the governing body on our delivery of the previous program, and look at how we build around the resourcing through the programming and the reporting through the implementation report to get a much stronger, the most powerful implementation mechanism that we've got, implementation and monitoring mechanism that we've got. I'd hope you could answer that question for us, Wolfgang, Senior in Multilaterals. No, look, I totally agree with you. And certainly in the references that we've had on these screens and in our papers regarding UN reform, we're not just referring to the development system reform. We're talking about it in its much broader scale. The extent to which we get actively engaged in the peace aspect, the peace pillar of the reform, you're right. I don't think we've done any assessment or proper analysis of that. But what we are proposing with this is that we look at not only the UN reform, but multilateral reform, the IFIs as well, in that broadest context, and how does the ILO play its most influential role in the broad multilateral international system based on the priorities that we identify through this sort of declaration, so that we don't go out there and try and be everything to everyone and put our fingers in every pie just because it looks nice, but really how do we become the experts in these defined areas, and how then do we have that influence in the rest of rest of the system. So certainly I'm not, in my thinking at least, it's not around just the UN development system, it's in that much broader context. But certainly, this is where I say this becomes a whole office responsibility, and the engagement and input from Multilaterals Department and the insights are just going to be critical as to how we can develop all of this.
Yeah, I'll only add that for the Commission, I think there was a recognition that that peace and diplomacy informed 1919, and it informed 1944, and it is informing what's going on right now. The Commission met over the course of a year, so beginning in October 2017, if you can recall back to that time, and ending in December. I guess its last meeting was at the very end of 2018. Over the course of that year, I certainly felt that commissioners were felt more and more of a sense of urgency about the state of the world, and that's not only, I'll only in quotes, the world of work. So they clearly saw their work and their recommendations as an anchor in peace and security, and so yes, we need to move in that direction as well.